The real thing that I'm looking for tonight is, of course, that key third place finish, which we were just talking about there in the break. Amy Klobuchar, the momentum is on her side. This would be a huge, huge victory for Amy. In fact, I would almost argue that a third place finish for Amy would be stronger and more important than a first place finish for Bernie.
So it's been a really good couple of days for Bernie Sanders. He's leading by 10 in a new national Monmouth poll, by 8 in a new national Quinnipiac poll, and by 7 in a new Morning Consult poll of the Super Tuesday states. And today is the New Hampshire primary, and if you look at the Real Clear Politics average, Bernie Sanders is up by about 7.5 points over Pete Buttigieg. So it's no surprise that, as you saw in that opening clip, the mainstream media, MSNBC and others, are already trying to downplay a Bernie Sanders victory, to basically ignore the fact that Bernie Sanders might win New Hampshire and talk about, of all things, who might finish third, and how Amy Klobuchar finishing third might be a bigger deal, a bigger win than Bernie Sanders finishing first. So you can see what they're doing, right? They're trying to set up a scenario where no matter what happens, Bernie Sanders loses tonight. If Bernie Sanders finishes second, then it's the end of days. Bernie Sanders is overestimated, and Pete Buttigieg is the next hot thing that's going to replace Bernie in the national polls soon enough. And even if Bernie Sanders does win New Hampshire and it's close, they'll say that Bernie Sanders didn't meet expectations. And even if Bernie Sanders wins, and wins big, wins by 6, 7, 8 points or what have you, they'll basically say, well, that's fine and good, I guess, but let's talk about the really important thing. Amy Klobuchar got 14% or 15% or whatever and ended up in a strong third. And isn't that the real story? Isn't that the real story here? Not that the guy who won New Hampshire and the guy that in all reasonable estimations won Iowa, which is Bernie Sanders, not Pete Buttigieg, has gone 2 for 2, and that people who go 2 for 2 almost always win the nomination every time since 1976. That's not the story. The story's going to be, it's a really good night for Elizabeth Warren, or a really good night for Amy Klobuchar, or a really good night for Pete Buttigieg. That's where they're going in the narrative. Because right now, the mainstream media is trying to reckon with the reality that Bernie Sanders is not just in this race, and he's not just competitive. He is quickly becoming the undisputed frontrunner. These polls show him with massive national leads, massive Super Tuesday leads. New Hampshire is likely going to be a strong state for Bernie. You have people like Joe Biden who are not only tanking in the national numbers, but he's already left New Hampshire. He's not even there right now. He's basically given up on the state, showing that he is building up that South Carolina fortress for one final stand, because if that goes south for him, then Joe Biden is done. Bernie Sanders right now has all of the major momentum and all of this narrative of saying, Pete Buttigieg is up in the polls. None of that is being reflected in enough movement nationally to even put him in the top 3 or 4, let alone be a challenger to Bernie Sanders. There is nobody with significant momentum nationally that's actually encroaching on Bernie Sanders. The only person that seems to be rising significantly is Michael Bloomberg, but in most polls, that's almost entirely at the expense of Joe Biden, and Bloomberg is still in the mid-20s at best, nowhere near Bernie Sanders, who in many polls is anywhere from 25 to 30 points nationally. The mainstream media has always tried this multi-pronged strategy with Bernie Sanders. They've tried to ignore him whenever possible, to basically quote polls and say, Biden's in first and Bernie Sanders is in second and Elizabeth Warren is in third and Kamala Harris is in fourth, but they don't mention Bernie Sanders in second. They say Biden first, Warren third, Kamala fourth. That was one of the first things I covered on this channel when I looked at the systematic Bernie blindness, Bernie blind spot the mainstream media tries to perpetuate. But when they can't ignore him, they try to excuse it away. Or when Bernie Sanders has any bit of bad news, they highlight it, they magnify it, they try to blow it up beyond reasonable proportions. Here, they're sort of stuck. Bernie Sanders can't be ignored. He is the national frontrunner. He is leading in the national polling averages for both the RCP and 538. He is now the favorite, according to most projections, to win the most delegates by convention time, even if it's unclear that he'll win a majority of delegates. But he certainly is on pace to have a strong plurality. You cannot ignore the systematic frontrunner. So, what you can do is try to effectively downplay any good news even before it comes. So tonight, Bernie Sanders winning New Hampshire, not even a big deal. In fact, you could say that Bernie Sanders winning New Hampshire is a loss because he didn't win it hard enough. And no matter how hard he wins it, it'll always be just not hard enough for you to perpetuate a narrative, to perpetuate a news cycle where this was a bad night or an underwhelming night for Bernie Sanders. And my goodness, what a heroic, gutsy performance from Amy Klobuchar or Pete Buttigieg, or whoever the neoliberal media is trying to push right now as an alternative to Bernie, and their desperate attempt to try to deny Bernie Sanders realistic, positive, balanced coverage. But this shows a couple key things. That MSNBC and the pundit class really do fear a Bernie Sanders win tonight. There's a chance Pete Buttigieg could win. It's a smaller chance, but not an infinitesimal one. Bernie Sanders isn't guaranteed victory tonight, but the odds are in his favor, strongly. And when Bernie Sanders wins tonight, because I do believe he will, there will be all sorts of efforts to downplay the significance. Where Pete Buttigieg wins, or where Amy Klobuchar is in a strong third, it's a sign of things to come. Bernie Sanders' successes are blips. I want Bernie Sanders supporters to realize that this is not fair and balanced and thoughtful political punditry and analysis. This is a willful attempt to distort the reality that you are seeing with your own eyes and you are hearing with your own ears. Listen to your instincts. Listen to the reality before you, which is that Bernie Sanders is the indisputable frontrunner in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary. And no amount of narrative building to downplay his successes or magnify his shortfalls will change that. Only a real material change in results will alter Bernie's frontrunner status, and there's no indication that that's happening, even if Amy Klobuchar gets a strong third place finish here. It's really time that we start shifting the narrative towards our direction. For so long in this race, there's been tons of discourse about, oh no, will Bernie endorse the winner? Will Bernie Sanders endorse the frontrunner? Joe Biden's the frontrunner. Will Bernie Sanders endorse Biden if and when he becomes the nominee? Will Bernie ensure that his supporters stay loyal? And these sorts of questions, which only ever served to try and limit Bernie Sanders, only tried to put Bernie Sanders in a position where he was either disloyal to the party or he would be seen as conceding victory, conceding defeat to his opponent. And it gave Bernie no way to answer. But now it's time to start asking that question ourselves. Everyone in the field needs to be asked this question. And if there was decent, fair media in the United States, every pundit and every news network would be asking every Democratic candidate this question. Bernie Sanders is currently the undisputed frontrunner in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary. If Bernie Sanders wins the nomination, will you endorse him? Will you encourage your supporters to move to him? Will you campaign with him? Will you do the 41 events for him that he did for Hillary Clinton in 2016? That's a question that every single one of the candidates, the smaller ones like Yang and Gabbard and those folks, and some of the bigger ones like Biden and Warren and Buttigieg, they all need to be asked this question. And if they don't answer, they should be tarred and feathered in the media for basically implying that they're not loyal to the eventual nominee. And it's also time, guys, to start thinking tactically about that convention. You don't want to count your eggs before they've hatched. I'm not suggesting we do that. But I do think it's crucial, given that Bernie Sanders needs to win a majority of delegates, or at least a strong plurality, that you get people on record to suggest that they will support the person that wins the most delegates. Because what we don't want happening is a last-minute brokered convention which allows the superdelegates and an alliance of neoliberals to steal the nomination from Bernie, even though he got more votes and more delegates than any other candidate. Potentially a lot more. And so now's the time to start asking people, if Bernie Sanders, because again, he's the undisputed frontrunner, all the data shows that clearly now, will you automatically back him and encourage your delegates to back him if he has the most delegates at the convention, even if it's not a majority of delegates? And if they say no, they should basically be pressured with the fact that they want the superdelegates to take the nomination away from the person that had the most support from regular rank and file Democratic primary voters. This is an absolutely crucial time for Bernie Sanders. You're going to see all of this distortion come at him. So it's time to ignore that and turn the tables a little bit and use Bernie Sanders' frontrunner status to build momentum and put his opponents in the hot seat for once.